Jai Hind and welcome to TEF Talks. This is Aadi. As you can see, I have with me Professor Madhav Nalapat, who's going to tell us what are the changes that he observes within China, especially after the Yangtze incident, which has led, probably, in my opinion, to a certain extent, China to be pushed back in a certain place, and as well as the COVID crisis that seems to be exploding with inside China. Will China change its outlook with the world, or will it find an opportunity to survive and do what it does the best? Sir, good evening, happy New Year, and welcome to the show.
Happy New Year to you and to your show.
So, sir, first question is let's kind of analyze where China is before we kind of start talking about the foreign policy and its game with the rest of the world. Where would you place China today?
Well, I'd like to say that China has always been good at taking advantage of the other party's mistakes. It's like a player who never has a double fault in tennis. So you don't make a double fault, the other chap makes a double fault, and somehow you accumulate more and more points and you come out doing well. So the Chinese are very good at using the mistakes of others. And you can see that active now. Joe Biden made this withdrawal from Afghanistan, if you recall, on the 15th of August 2021. And he did not even leave behind the Bagram Air Base. He just scooted out of Afghanistan and left about billions and billions of dollars worth of military equipment out there. A lot of that would have gone to China, a lot of that would have gone to Pakistan, but some of it would have remained behind. But so what happened then? Even today, the problem with Americans is they seem to have a long hangover. So even after you get drunk on a particular, if I may say so, on a wrong theory of, say, strategy or geopolitics, if you get over the hangover quickly, you can move on to the factual theory. But if you've got a long hangover, you keep repeating the mistakes that you've made. And in the case of Pakistan, Joe Biden believes that Pakistan is the key for making sure Afghanistan does not blow up visibly. He's already, I mean, frankly, the reality is it's already blowing up in a number of places. Women are being brutalized, moderates are being brutalized, minorities are being brutalized. All this because of the hurried American withdrawal and the handover to the Taliban. But it's not coming in the media. As far as Joe Biden is concerned, only concerned about what appears in American television or in American media because he's looking entirely from a political point of view and nothing else. Forget human rights, forget democracy, it's all politics. And from that point of view, he doesn't want the Afghan situation to blow up when he has basically, I think, whether he's convinced himself, I don't know, but certainly he's behaving as though he's convinced himself that the future of the entire Western world and Western civilization depends on Ukraine. That if something is done, if God forbid the Russians are not removed from the entirety of Ukraine, Western civilization will collapse. We had this in the 1960s. You remember, there was the domino theory of Vietnam, that if Vietnam falls, and I mean, if North Vietnam takes over South Vietnam, so there's actually one Vietnam, and North Vietnam, South Vietnam was an artificial divide, like it is in Korea. Then the whole of Asia would fall like a bunch of dominoes. India, they said, was tottering. Thailand was in bad shape. Indonesia was tottering. Actually, it was at that point in time. There's no doubt about it. Malaysia was tottering. It also was at that point in time, the Malayan Peninsula. But the reality is that North Vietnam, the North Vietnamese army, combined with the Viet Cong, overcame the United States, overcame its South Vietnamese partners. What happened to the rest of Asia? I mean, the Cambodia and Laos, those situations took place independent of Vietnam. In fact, Vietnam was opposed to certainly to Cambodia and to Pol Pot, that genocidal dictator who was supported by the United States and China, and who killed so many, hundreds of thousands of Cambodians. So the point is, Joe Biden has convinced himself that he needs Pakistan, or possibly Jake Sullivan has convinced him that you need Pakistan to be on your good side to prevent the Afghanistan kettle, from boiling over and spilling hot water all over the place when we, that is the whole of Western civilization, are engaged in this monumental crusade to protect our civilization from the Russian hordes. Now, that's one point. And when you have that kind of a situation, what happens? Well, you can't have, even, I mean, I think even Joe Biden as White House is smart enough to understand that a two front war is not a desirable thing. The only problem is they already have a war with China. They don't really, and but it's not really with Russia, it's with China. They already have a two front war, but they're pretending that it is not there, or believing that it's not there, and they're turning to China for help in controlling Russia and Ukraine when the Chinese Communist Party is the biggest gainer from the Ukraine conflict. And the PRC is the biggest gainer from the Ukrainian conflict. So you have a situation in which in Afghanistan you need Pakistan, or you think you need Pakistan. In where Russia is concerned, you need China, and you believe China will come to your side, and of course you believe Pakistan will come to your side. See, I just want to go on say very frankly, this is not the Afghanistan of the 1990s. This is not the Taliban of the 1990s. If you go back to, and I'm happy that at least some of my comments have been made not in private, not in closed door sessions, but openly. I'm there on record stating that within the Taliban there were six factions when they took over, and of these three factions were, one was dominated by the Chinese, two by the Pakistan military, and three were basically not dominated by either China or Pakistan. I call this the Free Taliban. The Free Taliban were young people, and today about nearly 90% of the cadres of the Taliban are young and are in the Free Taliban. The older group of the older groups that are in the control of Pakistan and China are extremely weak on the ground. And this is why you're seeing tension between the Taliban, the cadre of the Taliban, and the Pakistan military. The Pakistan military, the Chinese military, they run certain, so-called Taliban leaders who had a lovely time in Dubai and in various other places while this entire Taliban war was going on. And then they came back and they tried to boss over. But the youngsters have said, sorry, we're not going to be bossed over by you. You are not involved in the fighting. Who cares for you? And that is what is happening now. So even if Pakistan wants to save America and play the American game in Afghanistan, they they simulated that in the first situation in the 1990s. Now, even if they really want to do it, they can't do it. They're incapable of doing it. In fact, their own country now is under threat from the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan, and very importantly, from Pashtun pride. I've, I've met Pashtuns, who are located not only in Afghanistan, but in South Asia, in Europe, and they absolutely loathe the Pakistan military because they say that the Pakistan military, with its Potahar, contingent of generals and colonels and majors, they are trying to boss over the Pashtun people. So the Pakistanis can't help them there. The Chinese won't they can't help them in Afghanistan. The Chinese won't help them in Ukraine. But what happens? And again, in the point of view of Pakistan, the Americans know that China essentially has the upper hand in Pakistan. They know they're no longer top dog in Rawalpindi, in GHQ. That position has been handed over to China about 12 to 15 years ago, if not earlier. So from that point of view, again, they need China, and they believe China will help them. So as a consequence, China gets a free pass in a lot of things. Now, would you believe it? In Britain, for example, you can land in China on a China Airlines flight, and the certificate that you wave, that is your COVID test at in the in China before you board the aircraft, I mean, is accepted in Britain. Now, I mean, if this is not blind trust and blind faith, I don't know what is. But you can't. The British are very keen on this Ukraine, crusade. Boris Johnson and Joe Biden were the leaders of this crusade. So they're completely obsessed with Ukraine, and they don't want to quote unquote annoy China. So they're allowing Chinese into the UK, and a lot of them are going to be COVID positive, and you're going to have a fresh spread of infection there. I hope it's not going to create a major problem, but this is the whole situation. India, fortunately, we are insisting on tests when you arrive here, not just on departure but on arrival. Very few countries are doing that now, frankly. And that is because the Chinese are, according to the West, they need China to handle Pakistan so that Pakistan can handle Afghanistan. And they need China to handle Russia when it's in China's interest to ensure that it handles Russia in the way it has since February 24, 2022, which is to give Russia the money, the resources, and the diplomatic leverage it needs to continue this war.
Interestingly, sir, the scenario that you're painting out is reminiscent of what happened in the 60s and 70s when the first rapprochement happened with the US and the CCP. What tells us, it's like a bad movie playing again. Having said that, sir, China, of course, is has its own troubles as well. So, what is something that the Chinese would be looking out to take out from this particular situation? Because Ukraine, as you said, and I've been kind of harping on this in my channel for a long time, that this pre-obsession with Russia, especially the Western pre-obsession with Russia, is the most dangerous thing for the world today. What are the Chinese going to be trying to squeeze out of the West during this pre-obsession that plays out till the time the war doesn't come to a close, sir?
Well, I'd like to say that I think the main problem that is facing the CCP leadership is the fear that there is going to be an exodus of manufacturing industry away from China to other locations. Now, the Chinese, frankly, are not very concerned about India and their trading with Western countries or with, let's say, the Middle East or something like that, because their manufacturing doesn't come into that particular mix. In the case of let's say a country like Taiwan, where you have a large number of Taiwanese manufacturing companies active in China, who are looking elsewhere. Now, many of them are going to United States, but they find the US is horribly expensive. I mean, the dollar has been made incredibly expensive by the Federal Reserve. As a consequence, it's not really economical there to operate in the United States. India is an obvious candidate. But of course, and from that point of view, the Chinese are terrified that India is going to attract a lot of manufacturing from China into India, especially into the smaller towns. The larger cities are, yes, choked, but the smaller towns are in India, the places that are really expanding fast, that are really blooming, are the small towns. And from that point of view, the Chinese are terrified that the small towns are going to attract investment flowing from China and coming to India. Now, Adi, I have said this for quite some time, and I'll repeat it to you now because for some reason it doesn't seem to be sinking in. The Americans can never accept a strong Russia. Why? Because Russia is the one power that can challenge American hegemony or primacy in Europe. The Chinese will never accept, under the Communist Party, especially led by Xi Jinping, a strong India. Why? Because India is the one country that can challenge Chinese hegemony or primacy in Asia. So, America, there's no question that it will always try and instigate problems against Russia, and to the delight of America and China, if I may say so, the Germans, the French, the British have all headlong jumped into that particular trap, and they've all gone and challenged the Russians and doing what the Americans want them to do. I think, frankly, Americans have the least to lose from this war. They have enough petroleum. They have quite a lot of of food grain that they're grown there. They don't depend on Russia or Ukraine for either food grains or petroleum or on other or for many other resources. So they're happy. But the Europeans have stumbled into something which is going to set back Europe for a long, long time. So the point I'm trying to say, very very simply, is that in today's geopolitical world, the Chinese are absolutely terrified of India sucking in a large number of manufacturing industries from China. They see all these. You look at Udupi, the district where my university is based. It's got dozens of technical institutes. It's got about 6 to 7 excellent universities there, including a lot of technical faculties. You've got engineers, you've got technicians, you've got draftsmen, you have skilled labor, everything there in that one little district of Udupi in Karnataka. So, from that point of view, there are such districts across India. I mean, Udupi, I think, is definitely, pretty good at that. But there are other districts like that who have similarly got large numbers of trained manpower, and especially when you're talking of industries that today, for example, you can create systems in which you can have high-speed connectivity by air or whatever it is, because a lot of the what you produce is not large in size. You're not producing a steam turbine, for example, which is a huge kind of thing. You're producing, let's say, a smartphone, which you can hold in the palm of your hand. So, from that point of view, connectivity is easier than if you're producing huge kinds of manufacturing. And again, from that point of view, they're terrified of that. So, they are essentially looking at India, and they're looking to see if India can be given a bad reputation. And if I may say so, they're working very hard at it. They are, I know, for example, from my contacts in North America, in Europe, in Southeast Asia, in East Asia, we're talking about Taiwan, we're talking about Japan, we're talking about South Korea, that they are whipping up this fear that there will be an attack by China on India, and that attack could be in any city in India, everywhere. So no factory will be safe in India. Well, the fact is, we have a reasonable nuclear arsenal. We have a very good air force. We have an excellent military, which frankly is waiting to have a go at the Chinese once they come at us. They are waiting for that. We have a good navy. I wish that we have better protocols with the Americans and with the other Quad partners. We work out some security protocols, because a Quad minus the security component is an empty shell. I don't know why it's not being done so far, but it needs to be done. I hope India under Prime Minister Modi will take the lead in that. But so from that point of view, this is the propaganda. Don't invest in India, because tomorrow we may blow up your factory in India. We may bomb it. It's never going to happen. At the worst case scenario, they'll try and nibble at some of our land, some of our border areas. They, I don't think they'll succeed there at all. I think we are prepared for it. But that's the worst case scenario that they can do. But they are creating this fear that India is under a China threat. And when you say India, you mean the whole of India, north, south, east, west. And in the case of, and this fear they are creating all over, in the Europe, United States, etc., you're creating a picture of an unreliable country filled with hatred. You have all kinds of memes, you have bots, you have social media conversations in which they have been very strongly, incentivizing, oxygenating, which paint India as a country where there is murder and killing in every street. I've been in this country all my life, and frankly, there have been periods in which there have been the troubles in isolated places, and you have madcaps everywhere. You have madcaps from every community, but overall, the peace is being maintained. But the Chinese, through social media and through useful idiots in other countries who follow what they want, what the Chinese want them to do without knowing who it is that is goading them to this, they created an impression of a country in meltdown almost, which is the absolute reverse of the truth. So, from their point of view, I'd like to say they have a lot to worry about. Xi Jinping, in my view, dumped Deng Xiaoping's policy prematurely. That policy was speak softly, fashion a big stick, but speak softly, bide your time, hide your strength. He had no patience. He jumped forward, possibly because he wanted this third term for himself. And now, when he wants a fourth term, he'll need to do even more theatrics in the third term. And that is where I think India and Taiwan in particular, we need to watch out for.
Indeed, of course, the events in Yangtze tell us that that design, of course, playing out in front of us. But sir, how viable do you think the Chinese themselves think, for the lack of a better word, a panga with India is feasible?
Uh, Look, let me put a question to you, Adi. If there's an attack on Taiwan, there will be sanctions by the United States and European Union on China. 100%. If there's an attack on India, can you tell me 100% that there will be Western sanctions? We have seen attacks in Yangtze, we have seen attacks in Galwan. These are pretty major attacks. People were killed, blood was shed in the case of Galwan. In the case of Yangtze, fortunately, no. But will there be sanctions? I'm asking you that question. Do you feel there will be sanctions?
Not in this lifetime, at least, sir.
Well, I hope it'll be, I hope within the next 1 year, you with some skillful diplomacy and the leadership of Prime Minister Modi, we can ensure that there will be an assurance of sanctions if India is attacked, because that is the vulnerability. The second vulnerability is the Chinese don't need to take over the whole of India as they do in the case of Taiwan. They can only, they need to take over slices of territory. So they build themselves up in certain locations and then move in and take over slices of territory. And for them, that's a big victory. You know, if you a much bigger a much bigger person, let's say, you challenge a much bigger person, even if the challenge is not so what do I say, emphatic as challenging a smaller person, you gain much more from challenging a bigger person. And India is a very big target, next to China, the biggest target. So I'd like to say that there will be people in Beijing who are analyzing what needs to be done by Xi Jinping to show that he is a real warlord, a leader in wartime, a man who, remember, from the beginning of his term, at least from 2013 onwards, 2014, 2015, increasingly, has put PLA front and center of his public policy. The PLA is everywhere now in China, all over Chinese media, social media. It's all PLA, PLA, PLA. He's proclaiming himself to be a warlord. You have situations in the past, in Europe, for example, 1930s, in which some leaders put forward the military and basically, camouflage themselves under the cloak of the military. That's happening there. So now the point is, before 2027, when he is now fighting for his fourth term, he will need to show that he is really a warlord in action. And when you've got a choice of doing a limited operation against a country where there may not be sanctions, crippling sanctions on you, or a complete takeover of a country where there will be crippling sanctions. And more importantly, you will see a complete exodus of high tech people from Taiwan, assuming the horrible situation of China occupying that country takes place. And if that exodus goes, the Taiwanese tech industry goes with it. The Chinese will be left with nothing, frankly. So, from these two perspectives, I wouldn't basically go to the conclusion that Taiwan is the more obvious case, frankly. Having studied the CCP functioning up close, studied the mindset and mentality of the leadership up close, These are not, if I may say so, they are not, they are gamblers, but not reckless gamblers. They go to a casino when they believe that the odds are reasonably on their side, in fact very much on their side. And my worry is we need to get diplomacy established that one establishes a clear supply chain from the quad countries in particular to India in case we are attacked. We need to go in for a NATO kind of structure in which if one member of the Quad is attacked, all the other three members will join in that particular attack. We need to go in for that kind of formation. And secondly, we need the Chinese to be absolutely certain that crippling sanctions will follow in an attack on India, even if it's a limited attack focusing on Ladakh and Arunachal, which, in my view, is what the Chinese have in mind.
I absolutely agree with you. So I think I would go so far as to say, on a military perspective, of course, I'm not a military person, but there's something I wrote about as well, where I said that there has to be a red line that is drawn, and literally a red line on the ground, and the Chinese need to be told, you shoot, you cross that, we fire. Simple. We've had enough of your nonsense. There's no more fist fighting that's going to happen. You cross this, and you're done. So probably may just be, and I'm not sure of the repercussions, but of course. Uh, so my question to you would be about the foreign policy with a new foreign minister coming in. Uh, this change was supposed to happen somewhere in March. Uh, why now, and what is his priorities?
Look, the foreign policy of China is meant to camouflage the actual policy of the CCP. The foreign minister is, you have said that diplomacy basically is meant to give, let's say, be economical with the truth for the sake of the country's interests. So here it's a question of being economical with the truth for the sake of the party's interest. I think Mr. Wang Yi was a little too, what do I say, blunt to the Western world. And I think Xi Jinping is looking for someone who can have a more friendly face to the Western world. And the gentleman who has now come in is a person who has got tremendous networking in the United States in particular. And therefore, the expectation is he can lull the United States leadership into a situation where they don't believe China is a threat. And in the meantime, the Chinese will hollow them out from within, and they will make them weaker and weaker inside, so that without any kind of a actual conflict, they will achieve their goals of one thing, overlordship over Taiwan, and possibly complete control over the East China Sea and the South China Sea. You can see their South China Sea is more or less, unfortunately, they have more or less established their control. They are now moving to the east. They are moving to the South Pacific, the Pacific Island countries. They are moving to the west coast, of India. They are moving to the Gulf countries, having because the South China Sea is now more or less a Chinese Sea. It's been made that. So they're moving forward. So they believe they can do it in such a way if they can convince the United States, or if the US media and US politicians can allow themselves to be convinced. And believe me, it's very profitable to allow yourself to be convinced. Extremely profitable to be allow yourself to be convinced. And let's be honest, I mean, everybody needs money, and money gives you a good life. And there are various pathways to that good life. And a lot of those pathways are pathways that mean that you essentially, see China as an opportunity and not as a threat. If you see China as a threat, it's a different situation. If you see China as an opportunity, and then you have a wonderful foreign minister who knows the Western world, who knows how to speak in a way that the Western world believes that is the truth, who knows how to convince the Western world it's not China that's your problem. Maybe even telling, yeah, we know Russia is a problem. Frankly, we don't like the Russians at all, but we know it's a problem. What can we do? We have to live with this problem. We have no choice, but we have to live with Putin, although we don't like Mr. Putin. Well, Wang Yi would not be convincing in that role. The new chap would be convincing. So the fact is, he is according to Xi Jinping, an better camouflage than Wang Yi. I'm sure Wang Yi will not vanish into a sunset. I'm sure they'll find uses for him somewhere in some kind of special non-military operation in some countries, or possibly military. I mean, in some some special operations in some countries. But he'll be put to use, I'm sure. But this chap, the new foreign minister, his task is to lull the West into a state of relaxation where China is concerned. That yes, we are your opportunity. And the fact that he has succeeded in the United States is clear from the fact that from almost June, July, President Biden, I mean, has been entreating, in a sense, sometimes silently, sometimes vocally through other people, entreating Xi Jinping, please stop this man, Putin. Please stop this war. When Xi Jinping is the biggest beneficiary of this war, and China is the biggest beneficiary of this war. So this is obviously a very smart chap. Obviously, he knows what buttons to press to make sure that the Western world reacts in a correct way to Chinese. I would like to say to Chinese. I wouldn't like to say Chinese. Double speak. Let me use the word Chinese propaganda to communist Chinese propaganda. And from that point of view, this is the new foreign minister. I don't believe, he has been chosen because of anything to do with India. In fact, there was a previous ambassador to India, a very hardline chap. He was transferred. He's got a senior position in Beijing. And I think, he essentially believes that India should be put in his place. So it's nothing to do with India. It's to do with the Western world, especially the United States. Xi Jinping believes he can get his objectives without a kinetic conflict with the United States, without substantive sanctions even from the United States. The Ukraine war is helping that because sanctions are killing Europe, and therefore the Europeans are complaining to the Americans and damaging America also, damaging Joe Biden. But for the inflation caused by the Western sanctions, Joe Biden's Democrats would have won the House as well. It's Ukraine that has caused them to lose, and Ukraine that is going to make the Republicans popular in 2024, because that party knows the importance of ensuring that a foreign country does not hijack your domestic agenda. Unfortunately, Biden has allowed that. But what I'd like to tell you is this new man, he is tasked with the job. Wang Yi was tasked with the job of, of the third world, of Latin America, of Africa, India also, frankly. He was working very hard on lulling India to sleep, and to a considerable extent, he succeeded. For a long time, we didn't allow Daulat Beg Oldie to be reopened. We didn't, so many other airfields that were disused, we never allowed them to be open. We believed the Chinese said that tomorrow, day after, we are going to be friends. It took a little bit of a long time, and fortunately, under a new prime minister, before that stopped working. But the new man's task is not India. The new man's task is convincing the Americans that, look, don't worry, we are an opportunity, we are a key, we are a solution. Just as you had Americans like George W. Bush, who thought the key to basically, confronting the Taliban was Pakistan, the Pakistan military. You remember George W. Bush in 2001. He handed over, he outsourced much of the Afghan war to Pakistan. And from that point in time, it was very clear one day the Taliban would completely defeat the Americans, and poor Joe Biden was presided over that defeat. So I'd like to say that this is his job. It's nothing to do with India, I'd like to say. India is being now looked after not only by influence operations, that phase is over, it's special operations, if I may say so. A much more sinister kind of activity is taking place in India. That's taking place in America also. But on top of that, you've got influence operations. And in this influence operation, the new man is expected to read the Western mind, read the US psychology in particular, and make them believe that it's Russia that's the threat and not China.
He won't have a hard time doing that, sir, because the pre obsession with Putin is something that I think the global south does not understand, which brings me to my last question, sir. And bear with me, because the pivot to Asia, which was started by Obama, and who said, this is what the future is, and this and that. He moved off from, he wanted to reduce his imprint in the Middle East. He proposed a move off from Afghanistan, which, of course, as you said, was fortunately or unfortunately presided by Joe Biden. The question that I'm coming to, sir, the pre obsession with Ukraine today has been termed as three, four things. One, to reduce the influence of Europe as a power itself who was trying to assert itself. Europe is now completely under the shadow of the Americans, and they have to kind of follow the line with regards to their game with the Russians. Uh, of course, weakening Russia was a big thing that they wanted to achieve with this entire thing. And somewhere down the line, I kind of did not really think that they thought through the implications on China in a rather very, very clear way. And that's where I say that the Nancy Pelosi's visit, just a jhatka sort of a affair where they tried to put China down and under a little bit of a pressure and send a message, happened. Having said that, sir, the realization today that China may be able to help them, is it a natural, kind of the history replaying out, or is it something again that you're saying, which is part of an influence operation which is being done to make the Americans kind of say, listen, you know what, yeah, we've got issues with Taiwan, but as you said, we don't like Putin either. He's got a lot of problems, all this, all that. Uh, is this part of a sort of a narrative that the Chinese are going to start building upon, where they're going to undercut the Russians as well?
Well, I'd like to say that again. I've said this about the third month of the Ukraine conflict, that Xi Jinping is under attack from within his party for being too soft on the West and not supporting Vladimir Putin hard enough. The fact is that the Communist Party cadres love Putin, and they believe that Putin is standing up and going after Ukraine. And what is Xi Jinping doing about Taiwan? Taiwan is far smaller than Ukraine, and the Americans have got a direct supply route to Ukraine, which they don't have in the case of Taiwan. So Xi Jinping is talking about his great military prowess. So they're basically asking this question. Putin has challenged NATO, because it's a proxy war between NATO and Russia. It's very clear, and he's gone after a much bigger country with a much more, what do I say, a much more, a much more powerful a military force, Ukraine, and you can't even go after Taiwan. What's wrong with you? So I'd like to say I don't think there's any possibility that Xi Jinping can dissociate from Putin. No way at all, I can tell you. And if, God forbid, Putin goes away, the person who takes his place will be even more of a hawk than Putin. In my opinion, Putin is under pressure not because he's bombarding Ukraine too much, but because he's bombarding Ukraine too little. And and I think he's under heavy pressure to go all out against Ukraine. And unfortunately, I think that's going to come soon. I feel sorry for the Ukrainian people. Having said that, I don't believe the Americans have any negativity about the Europeans. In fact, the problem with the Americans is that many of them are actually Europeans who have who are basically on the wrong side of the Atlantic. I mean, I don't want to name people, but in the Biden administration, there are multiple individuals who are Europeanists, in which the navel of the world is Europeans across both sides of the Atlantic. We common European people across both sides of the Atlantic. So I don't think so. But the Americans have this long term goal of basically weakening Russia. That's a fact. Now, the Europeans have bought into that because they are worried about, and I think to some extent justifiably so, because assuming Russia becomes a very successful economy and it's going to have a very large military, in that situation, it will obviously dominate Europe. So, from the European point of view, also, there is a logic. But in my opinion, Ukraine was not the place to launch this particular operation. And the way it is being done through financial sanctions against ethnic Russians, it is damaging Western institutions terribly. Who is going to trust the dollar, the euro, the Swiss franc? To some extent, the Japanese yen, although it's hardly ever used in this kind of a context. Who's going to trust the British pound? Because all these countries have taken over property and assets worth billions and billions of dollars from people with European passports. These oligarchs, first of all, most of them are Jewish and therefore belong to a persecuted minority. They are not Christians, they are Jewish. And secondly, the reality is that almost all of them, none of them have really Russian passports. They have foreign passports. So, what does that mean? That if you're a Chinese and you've got money in Europe, in London, or in United States, or in Frankfurt, or in Zurich, tomorrow the Swiss authorities can take it over in 24 hours. The way the assets of these ethnic Russians were taken over, ethnic Chinese accents, ethnic Arab money, ethnic South Asian money can be taken over. And this is the bonanza to the Chinese because now they will migrate to the Chinese shores, to Macau, to Hong Kong, to places like that because they will not trust anything where the West is involved, including in some offshore places like Dubai, where the West is extremely, as of now, influential. I'm not saying 3 years from now, but as of now, influential. I think they're trying to shed that influence throughout the Middle East because they're understanding that that kind of closeness to the West is no longer an advantage, it's a disadvantage. But they're destroying their faith in their currencies, in their institution. They're, they're destroying supply chains that are causing inflation across the world. They're causing social turmoil across the world, including their own countries. They're causing a horrible situation to develop in winter, not least for the unfortunate people of Ukraine. So this is happening. I don't believe Joe Biden had this feeling that he has got to destroy Europe. No, he made the mistake of believing some idiot in the CIA or Defense Intelligence Agency or the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research that told him that Vladimir Putin is on his last legs politically. One foo, and Vladimir Putin will blow away, like some dust. And I think that was the mistake that Biden made. He underestimated the resilience of Putin. He underestimated the resilience of the system that Putin presides over. And they're blowing and huffing and puffing. And Putin is still standing. This is, I think, the mistake they made. They believed that they've created this feeling that Putin said that we will take Kiev in 3 days. Putin never said that. I don't know. I mean, if somebody has listened to Putin and taped him, please play that tape out because all Western channels and those who follow them in other parts of the world say, "Oh, Putin want to take Kiev in 3 days." I've never heard Putin say that. I have never heard Putin say anything other than what he has been saying right from, I would say, about 2015, 2016 onwards, which is that the Russian speaking parts of Ukraine should have complete autonomy and should not be threatened by the other parts, especially because now the the Ukrainian nationalists, so to speak, are now essentially uh, turning against the Russian speaking Ukrainian. That's all he's been saying. And that's all he's been doing. So, quite frankly, I think whoever in the CIA or DIA or the Bureau of Intelligence Research came up with this finding that Putin is in last leg. I suspect somebody in Britain, MI6 or something, must have come forward. Maybe Boris Johnson got it in a dream and communicated that to Joe Biden. And Joe Biden, to talk to Sullivan. Maybe it come in a dream there. But frankly, that was the mistake these guys made, quite frankly. And I think the mistake that Putin made was to assume that the West would not shoot itself by sanctions that will harm itself. And having seen the pain of these sanctions, Xi Jinping is the happiest man around because sanctions on China will be even more painful than sanctions on Russia. So that gives him greater freedom of action in Taiwan. India, as I already told you, I don't think, from my understanding, the Chinese are very worried about getting sanctioned, and of course they are seeing very happily the kind of back and forth that's taking place between India and the Western countries in terms of diplomatic language, I think Ambassador Minister Jaishankar is doing an outstanding job of calling out the hypocrisy of the West, and the West is now caught in that particular thing. But it's not a very friendly exchange, and from that point of view, each such exchange, each such testy exchange of barbs, if I may say so, and the Western diplomats are basically hiding behind journalists. They're not saying anything directly on camera. They're making journalists say these unpleasant things, and naturally when it's said in public, in a public setting, the minister has to stand up, and he is standing up boldly and bravely, and if I may say so, correctly. But I'd like to point out that from the Chinese point of view, let me tell you very clearly that they are looking to see if there's any appetite for sanctions. And if they believe there is no appetite for sanctions, the more they believe that, the stronger will be the pressure on Taiwan. The stronger will be the building of capacity across the border and the effort basically to see if they can grab a quick chunk of territory and at the expense of India. I happen to believe that won't happen under Prime Minister Modi, but the fact is people in Beijing may not believe that. So this is the reality that's coming today. I think the Americans and the Europeans have made a horrible mistake because Russia is half of Europe, half of Asia. Cutting yourself from Russian resources is harming Europe and economically in a horrible way. And when Europe is harmed economically, America also will be harmed. Not to the extent that will be harmed if Asia were to be harmed. But today, the Western world, forget about Western institutions, Western currencies. Western goodwill in Africa, in South America, in Asia is eroded sharply because all that Western diplomats can think about is Ukraine. There was a time when Israeli diplomats, in India at least, all they could do when they opened their mouths was Iran, Iran, Iran. Finally, they got the hint that we don't want to listen to Iran. Just forget about Iran and deal with us, India. Say India, India, India. Don't say Iran, Iran, Iran. Now, a Western diplomat, wherever he or she goes, the only word that comes out is Putin, and the second word is Ukraine. Putin, Ukraine, Putin, Ukraine, Russia, aggression, Russia, aggression. For God's sake, it's not our war. You started this war. We are in it with you where the Indo Pacific is concerned. We are in it with you where Asia is concerned. In fact, the Eurasian continent, which you seem to be so dismissive of because of the way you're basically handling geopolitics. And we are in it with you where China is concerned. For God's sake, understand that. The Israelis got it. I hope someday Western diplomats also will get it.
There need a whole change of the setup, and especially the neocons and the globalists need to kind of be sidelined in some ways. Till the time that breed of people are there, I think what it's damn difficult. But sir, thanks so much. This has been a wonderful perspective because this gives me a big question, as a matter of fact, which I'm going to ponder upon for the next little bit. Is the West actually against China? You know, that's something that you'll have to kind of think about and see whether the current situation and Joe Biden, what he's done with regards to the pre-obsession with Ukraine. Sir,
Let me just quietly and quickly answer that. We are in the middle of Cold War 2.0. Cold War 1.0 was between the United States and the USSR principally. Cold War 2.0 is between the major democracies and China, and that is a reality. In the West, more and more people are understanding that reality, and more people are beginning to understand that Biden, Scholz, Macron, Rishi Sunak, all of them, Trudeau, have all jumped at the wrong war, at the wrong place, at the wrong time, with the wrong enemy. So I can tell you, Cold War 2.0 is a fact. It's a fact of life. And believe me, I don't think it's going to be even a couple of years before the Western world understands that. But in the meantime, they're doing tremendous damage to themselves by trying to return to a dead war, which is Cold War 1.0 between the US and the USSR. Thank you.
I think that's wonderfully summarized, sir. Thank you so much. I couldn't have done any close to that. Thank you for your time, sir. As always, it's a learning experience talking to you, and I hope for many more interactions in the future. Till then, sir, Jai Hind.
Jai Hind.